Everyone hears me and sees me, all right? Yeah?
Yes.
Okay, so I'll start. I'll make it short. I'll jump right in. So we're going to talk about the science behind the forest bathing, but it will be very much in the broad sense, because we're not only going to focus on the mindfulness and the mental, but also all the vast array of different physical, conscious, unconscious, direct and indirect health benefits that you get from a forest bathing experience and contact with forest biodiversity in general. So we'll be the two talking today about forest biodiversity and health. Okay, it's working. I wanted to start with a short personal anecdote. I'm currently talking from the south of Belgium, where since my earliest childhood, I've been building camps with my cousins, a big bunch of them. And every summer we would gather and build camps, which was in a silver fir forest, as you see here. It's right here in the backyard. And we would use eagle ferns to make the walls. And then on the way, we would eat some brambles and get nettles to eat nettle soup. What I didn't know back then is that this contact with biodiversity had an effect on my health. And these were direct, for example, through the consumption of the brambles and the vitamin C and fibers that are in there, but also indirect and long-term because this stimulated my immune system, which can have long-term effects. So this is what this presentation is going to be about. One thing that I didn't know back then is that this is a very species poor forest. And if we were playing in a more diverse forest, we would probably have had even more health benefits. So after this personal anecdote, let me quickly present myself. I did a master in ecology in Brussels. During my master, I had the chance already to work on forests, but they were mangrove forests in Kenya. Then I worked in Switzerland on the drought tolerance of forests. And last year I was in Rome working on deforestation and biodiversity. So it's clear that my focus is on biodiversity and ecological processes. It's going to be on forests, of course, and nowadays in European forests, because I'm doing a PhD on the effect of forest biodiversity on thermal comfort in European forests.
Yeah, and I'm just going to jump in here and introduce myself. So both Loïc and I have a different view of towards nature and its influence on us. And that's because we have contrasting backgrounds. I am a lecturer in environmental psychology at the University of Surrey, with 12 years experience working as a researcher in various environmental psychology questions. The picture here on the left from 1999 is me in my final year in high school. It was first in high school in the state of Oregon in the United States that I discovered the healing powers of the forest. I would often spend time alone in the forest in my local park as my refuge from all of the drama of adolescence, you know, like when you break up with your boyfriend and then he's dating someone else, and how that's just like when you're 19, sorry, when you're like 17, that's like the worst thing in the world. I would spend time in the forest as a way to cope with all the stresses of adolescence. And I would get a reflection from being in the forest, you know, a sense of perspective that my problems were a bit small. And so that then led me to want to investigate scientifically this therapeutic experience of being in the forest. And so I did, if you could just click forward, Loïc, for me. So I did my master's in environmental psychology. I did a PhD looking at the psychological benefits of walking in nature. And then since 2017, I've been really interested on biodiversity and its relationship to mental health and well-being. That's me. Thank you.
So this was a short introduction of us. Now, an introduction to biodiversity. What is it and why would it be important? Now, I'm sure you have an idea of what it could be, But very simply put, it's the variety of life forms on Earth. It's a simple definition, but actually it includes a lot. We're talking about the variety, not only of species, but also at the organism level. For example, in their genetic makeup, all up to populations and communities and ecosystems. So it's a continuous characteristic of nature, and it's context dependent. For example, forest with 5 species in Finland might be biodiverse in that context, but it wouldn't in the tropics. And why would it be interesting to study in the context of health benefits? Well, it's because a lot of research has focused typically on comparing green, can be parks, urban forests, natural forests, with an urban environment. And they found many effects, a wide variety of effects, but also a lot of unexplained variation. And so that's why now research is focusing on discovering which aspects of this green is going to be important to maximize these health benefits. And that's why we're looking at biodiversity as one of the potential and most interesting characteristics of nature to provide health benefits. And the main idea is that biodiverse nature will provide more of the health benefits, and it will be healthier itself. And this is important because a biodiverse forest is more resilient against natural hazards arising, for example, from climate change, the invasion of non-native species, or drought episodes. So because of this resilience, it also makes the provision of those benefits more sustainable in time. And this is what we're going to study in the context of our project. It's called Dr. Forest. It's a European project, which includes Melissa, Katrina, and I. We had prepared a small video as an introduction, but I will skip it and just explain it because of the trouble in the beginning. It's gonna be faster. So we're 5 different countries. There's Germany, France, Austria, Poland, and Belgium working on it. And together, we're a multidisciplinary team, and we're studying different health, biodiversity, health pathways. And they're very varied. We don't only look at the benefits, but also the risks, which make it really interesting. Potential risks, but we'll talk about it in more detail, are, for example, irritation from urticating hairs from oak processionary caterpillars, diseases transmitted by ticks, and allergies from pollen. But of course, we're also going to talk about the benefits, which are the mental benefits from visual and auditory cues from the forest, but also the provision of products like mushrooms and medicinal plants, the regulation of extreme weather conditions, and the filtering of the air. I think this is Melissa's part again.
Okay, I'll jump in there again. So the question is, why would biodiverse forests be better? How exactly does biodiversity come to influence our human health and well-being? And when I started looking at this, there was the World Health Organization collaborated with the Convention on Biological Diversity on biodiversity and health, but they didn't really tell me what were the pathways. They mentioned things like Loïc just said, how we get medicines from the biodiverse species, we get food, but I still needed something that could really make it clear for me. So next slide, please. And so a panel of 26 experts from different disciplines worked on a project that I led that was funded by the Volkswagen Foundation. And our purpose was to really map out what are the exact pathways, exactly how does biodiversity come to influence our human health and well-being. And we worked on this for over a year, and we came up with these 4 domains of pathways that link biodiversity to human health. And these are that biodiversity influences human health by reducing harm. And this is things like biodiversity provides us with medicines and food and clean water. And that, reduces our harm and has a good impact on our health and well-being. But biodiversity can also cause harm as well. I think, the coronavirus is a good example of how microorganisms can cause harm to us, as well as Loïc just mentioned ticks as well. But biodiversity can also influence our health and well-being by restoring and building our capacities. So contact with biodiversity can restore our ability to concentrate or focus our attention, stress recovery, but also may encourage physical activity or transcendental experiences. We will have examples of all of these as we go further in the presentation, but I just want to say here that this model highlights that for most of the pathways, a person needs to have contact with biodiversity. So a person needs to be exposed to biodiversity. That means, your frequency or duration of exposure to the environment or biodiversity. And then also, once you have contact with biodiversity, what's your experience with that biodiversity? Are you looking at it through a screen, like watching a David Attenborough BBC documentary? Or are you at a zoo, for example? Are you looking at it directly or indirectly? And what's your activity? Are you interacting with biodiversity, but listening to a podcast or talking with your friends? And that might have impacts on the pathways and health outcomes. Thank you.
So as Melissa said, now we're just going to go over the different parts of the model by illustrating some interesting examples. And we're going to start with which may be the most counterintuitive part of the pathway. It's that, the one below, is that nature can also cause harm. For example, by the transmission of Lyme or tick encephalitis, and of course the troubles that arise from being exposed to oak processionary caterpillars. But the good news is that biodiversity somehow can also provide partial solutions. And I thought it was quite interesting. The figure on the right is from a massive review from a partner of ours in Dr. Forrest. He looked at, they looked at 400 different papers on the effect of forest biodiversity on the transmission of and the thriving of pests. And they found, this pathway to be quite common. So the advantage of having a biodiverse forest, let's take the processionary moth. It needs to find the right host tree, which is the conifer in the picture. If you have a biodiverse forest, first of all, the pine, the conifer species is already diluted in the landscape, so harder to find. And the moth finds this through visual and olfactory cues, which are both diluted. Because they have to look longer also for these host trees, they are more heavily predated. The predators of this moth have more time to consume them, and there are more predators as well in this biodiverse forest because there are more resources and habitats to sustain a stable predator population in a biodiverse forest. So that's one way how biodiversity can cause harm, but at the same time mitigate it somehow. Next, I'm going to talk a bit more in detail about the reducing harm part of the pathway that you see above. And there's different components to it. So first of all, the easiest to get is the provisioning function part. As Melissa already mentioned, it's, for example, simply put, the provisioning of food. And in the picture, you see a whole variety, actually a biodiversity in foods, which of course will have an effect on your health through the variety of it. And of course, they're all pretty healthy foods. I put some exclamation marks to all of the foods that are related to either a forest or tree species. But specific to these foods is also that they're all pollinated by animals. In fact, a major proportion of our food crops are at least partially depending on animals to have a yield. And the interesting thing is that, of course, you need also biodiverse nature to sustain a population of animals that can do this pollination. So here you have a direct and an indirect effect of biodiversity on this provisioning function. Next is a regulating function of nature, which leads to a reduction in harm. And this is most closely related to my PhD topic. The easiest to understand is when I start a story with heat waves, which have very obvious health effects. They can lead to heat stress, heat stroke, and death in, death mostly in the most vulnerable parts of the population. But they can have disastrous effects. In 2003, there was a massive heat wave that killed 70,000 people in Europe in just 2 months. So the implications are quite important. It's the #1 weather-related source of mortality in Europe. And the bad news is that, of course, this is just going to get worse with climate change. For Belgium, for example, we expect an increase from 1 heat wave day on average per year to 27 of them under business as usual scenarios. And this is going to be worse in cities where they expect 41 heat wave days. So there needs to be some nature-based solution, and forests and forest biodiversity can provide one of these solutions, a partial solution at least. Why? Well, let's take this picture back. So you can imagine us playing as kids in the forest, maybe even during that 2003 heat wave. And we were protected by the forest in 2 major ways. First of all, the forest through a dense canopy will simply shelter us from the solar radiation. So there will be less sunlight coming on the forest floor and be radiated back as infrared, making the whole thermal environment more livable. A second way is through evapotranspiration. Trees are continuously pumping water from the soil and evaporating them through their leaves. And in doing so, they convert water to water vapor. And this conversion takes up heat from the environment, which lowers the air temperature. And these things happen together. So this is a direct and short-term effect that the forest can have on the mitigation of extreme events, heat waves or cold spells as well. But at the same time, there's, of course, also a very indirect and very long-term effect, because the same forest is going to store in the midterm, it's going to store a lot of carbon, which will reduce the greenhouse gases and mitigate climate change and hopefully lead to less heat waves in the future. And biodiversity will strengthen both pathways. It has been seen that biodiverse forests will store more carbon on average at a global scale, but they will also store it in the longer term because they are more resilient to adverse events that can arise from climate change itself. For example, these extreme droughts. And about the direct effect, well, what the numbers say is if you compare a city environment with urban green, you can expect a reduction of about 1 degree on warm days. So, but it's very much on average. So it's still a quite substantial effect, but the effect gets much larger if you're going to look at forests specifically. And if you compare this to what you measure in macro climate stations, on average, you can expect a decrease of 4 degrees of temperature maxima, and actually an increase of the temperature minima at night, because the forests really buffer out the fluctuations of the temperature. And this is a very big study at a global scale. But it gets really impressive if you're going to compare an urban environment with a forest. Researchers in Freiburg did this, and they found on a heat wave day a reduction of 26 degrees in perceived temperature. And this clearly shows that the forest can have huge benefits in terms of thermal comfort. And you can imagine that it will have effects on health also, especially in these extreme cases. So this is what we're studying now. So to study whether biodiversity itself will have an effect in this buffering capacity, we installed these small microclimate stations in 4 different countries in Europe. And we're measuring the 4 variables that are important for your thermal perception, which are radiation, air humidity, and air temperature, and the wind speed. And the main hypothesis is that biodiverse forests will improve this buffering, for example, because the different shapes, canopy shapes, will provide a more efficient canopy space filling, as you see in the picture on the right. So this is how we're going to objectively measure the effect of biodiversity. This is ongoing, but we also have plans to study this subjectively by taking real human beings in the forest and giving them questionnaires, but also by taking physiological measures, and of course still measuring the objective thermal environment. And this will be linked to a study by Melissa and other colleagues of ours on mental well-being. And I think it's super interesting, and especially because we'll be able to study the interaction of our both topics. That is, for example, will the improved thermal comfort of the forest increase your mental well-being? And conversely, will your improved mental well-being from being in the forest environment broaden the range of temperature acceptability, or your preference? Will it make you more tolerant? And I was wondering to you, but you can answer in the chat or keep your answer for later. What is your experience with yourself or the people that you guide? Did you experience difficulties in being mindful, for example, on when you were cold or warm? And do you think the forest had an effect on this? Yeah, I'd be really curious to know, because we're still planning this project. And now I give the word to Melissa, and I think it's better that we switch now the presenter mode.
Sharing my screen, I think. Okay, and then 1 second. So you can see that, that's great. Yeah, so as Loïc said, I will talk about the restoring and building capacities pathways now. So the restoring capacities pathway refers to the recovery of the capabilities that have been diminished through the demands of dealing with everyday life. Some of you may know this, so over time, dealing with everyday life can tax our resources and lead to mental and physical ill health. And that environments that support the restoration of these depleted resources are called restorative environments. But how, so we already know that nature has an impact on restoring our capacities, but we don't really know much about how the biodiversity of the environment might influence this. There are 2 theories of restorative environments. The first is attention restoration theory, by Rachel and Stephen Kaplan, which focuses on the aspects of the environmental experience that allow for the restoration of the ability to direct or focus our attention and concentrate. You can see here with the two pictures of people who clearly are just exhausted mentally from work. And according to the attention restoration theory, a person can restore their depleted capacity for concentration or focusing their attention when they experience 4 qualities in the environment. And these qualities are being away, so experiencing a sense of escape from our day-to-day routine, something that we may not have had recently with the COVID pandemic lockdowns, but also that nature helps restore us because it's fascinating. It captures our attention. We don't have to concentrate. But an environment will be restorative if it has extent. If we experience that environment is organized in a coherent way to sustain exploration. And finally, that there's a person-environment fit between the environmental setting and what you want to do. And if you experience all 4 of these qualities in an environment, you should experience attention restoration and be this person here at the bottom right who's like, yes, I can now focus and concentrate on work. However, biodiversity is not systematically addressed in the theoretical writings of the attention restoration theory by Rachel and Stephen Kaplan. Myself and others have hypothesized that elements of biodiversity may better serve attention restoration because they may be more likely to be more fascinating and therefore facilitate the experiences of being away or extent, feeling that you're in another world or being compatible to what you want to do, which may be to just get away from it all. And so to test this, a study asked people who went on a group walk in nature to assess the biodiversity that they perceived or thought was in that environment. So this is why I use the cartoons here, because this is about people's perception or their assessment of the number of different species of birds, butterflies, and plants that they think are in the environment when they were doing their group walk, and also do a questionnaire about their experience of that environment with regards to being away, fascination, etc. And we found that perceived bird species richness was associated with a greater sense of fascination, being away, compatibility, and extent, but that the perceived species richness of butterflies and plants, how many butterflies did I think was in the environment I was walking in, didn't have any relationship with being away or fascination. So it was only really the birds that had an impact here. So attention restoration can also be assessed through changes in cognitive tests after exposure to a natural environment compared to a gray environment. And studies, systematic reviews have shown consistently that there is this difference on cognitive testing, so that nature does restore our ability to focus our attention and to think mentally. But what about biodiversity? An experimental study looked at 3 urban forests with varying vegetation density. And participants were randomly assigned to view 20 photos of either the high, medium, or low biodiversity groups. And then before and after, they had to do an attention task or a cognitive task. And they found that attentional capacity was greatest in the urban forest with the high biodiversity, and that it was lowest, people's results on these cognitive tests were the lowest after viewing the photographs of the low biodiversity group. So suggesting that the biodiversity of a forest can boost our ability to direct attention. The second theory of restoring capacities is the stress reduction theory by Roger Ulrich, which states that natural environments benefit health by facilitating recovery from stress, and that being in nature reduces our stress by reducing our emotions, reducing our heart rate, and enhancing our positive emotions. And in the theoretical writings of Roger Ulrich, he stated that environments that will be restorative from stress are those environments that have a moderate complexity, that they'll have depth, water, a focal point, deflected vistas, and that you feel safe. And so I tried to find a photograph here that was demonstrating all of those qualities. And Roger Ulrich in his theoretical writings did say that biodiversity could be a measure of the complexity. And so here we would expect that an environment with moderate complexity, so like Goldilocks and the Three Bears, not too much biodiversity and not too little biodiversity, but right in the middle will be the sweet spot to reduce people's stress. So we already know that natural environments reduce physiological measures of stress, that compared to gray environments, natural environments reduce heart rate, blood pressure, and the stress hormone cortisol. But what about biodiversity? An experimental study was conducted that measured people's blood pressure while they sat looking at meadow-like arrays of different species of herbs and grasses. And they found that blood pressure reduced as the number of plant species richness in the meadows increased, as you can see here in the graph. So on the bottom is the number of plant species, and over here on the y-axis is the decrease in blood pressure. And we can see that the decrease in blood pressure really peaks at this intermittent, the middle level of species richness. So this suggests that the theoretical writing of the stress reduction theory seems to hold true. So the other way you can assess stress reduction in this theory is through improved emotions. And we already know from studies that contact with nature can improve positive emotions and reduce negative emotions. But again, what about biodiversity? In an experimental study in 3 broadleaf forests, assessed people's emotions after watching a slideshow of photos in each of these different types of forests. So people were randomly assigned to either look at the photos of the high biodiversity forest or the low biodiversity forest, for example. And they found that positive feelings were greatest in the forest of medium biodiversity. Oh, sorry. And this again provides support for Roger Ulrich's theory that the middle amount of biodiversity is going to be the sweet spot for reducing stress. That not too much biodiversity and not too little biodiversity is good for reducing our stress and improving our emotions. So now I'm going to talk about the building capacities pathway. And the building capacities is about how we can facilitate people to take activities like being physically active in nature. So this isn't recovering from anything, but this is building and providing us with new opportunities for physical activities or psychological experiences. It helps us to strengthen our capacities rather than restore anything that's depleted. So physical activity, we know, is important for mental health and well-being, and that green spaces provide a safe, accessible, attractive setting for physical activity. In fact, Studies on green exercise or exercise outdoors show that it has an added benefit compared to physical activity indoors. And that enhancing streetscapes by increasing biodiversity may promote physical activity. So someone may, as in this photo, choose to run in a street or an area of the city that has more trees. And that could be because of Loïc's mentioning maybe it's a lot cooler in those areas for doing physical activity. So ash trees are part of the urban forest. They're often planted in neighborhoods, especially in the United States, but they're being killed in the US by an invasive species called the emerald ash borer. In the UK, they're being killed by a fungus. And here's a picture of the same street in the United States before and after the invasive species. And you can see here that the invasive species is just killing these trees and that they're not producing leaf anymore. So this is what it's like now to be on the street in Ohio. And a study was conducted in the United States looking at US counties that had lost ash trees because of this invasive species and compared it to US counties who had yet to have this invasive species. And they found that compared to areas that did not lose ash trees yet to this invasive species, that people in the areas that have lost ash trees, they reported doing less outdoor exercise and outdoor recreation. And that this loss of ash trees didn't have any impact on people's indoor recreation. So again, suggesting that the streetscape may facilitate outdoor physical activity. So another pathway biodiversity influences human health in the building capacities domain is by facilitating social cohesion. So social interaction, social cohesion within neighborhoods are related to health and well-being. We know this already. But that biodiverse environments could be attractive places to socialize with others and meet neighbors, and that biodiverse environments could increase neighborhood social cohesion and social interaction. However, there's really not a lot on biodiversity and its relationship to social cohesion. And one study by Shanahan et al. 2016 found that there was no relationship between the vegetation complexity of urban green space and social cohesion. But again, this is an area that we could do more research in. So another way that biodiversity influences human health is via transcendent experiences, such as awe, humility, and self-reflection. We already know that these experiences contribute to well-being, and that sights and sounds of nature, both mundane and awesome, can elicit these transcendent experiences. And two studies, so the relationship between biodiversity and transcendent experiences was investigated in two studies in the UK. And these studies found that actual bird species richness was related to greater self-reflection. They also found that actual tree species richness was also related to greater self-reflection, and that people's perception of the birds, butterflies, and plants, so the number of species that they thought was in that environment, was also related to their self-reflection ability. Oh, sorry, I went too fast. And then finally, biodiversity can influence human health and well-being via the place attachment and place identity pathways. So place attachment is that the phenomenon of us having emotional connection to environments, and these environments can be built or natural. So, you know, things like how you love your home, or that like you love New York, right? But our attachments to environments can also form part of our self-concept and who we are. And this is called place identity. So here's the example of like, I am Amsterdam, or I am Manchester. Like this city or in this place is who I am. It defines me. You know, I'm an Oregonian, or, you know, I'm Britain, you know, I'm a British person, right? We have these identities that are shaped by geographical areas. And both place attachment and place identity are associated with psychological well-being, and losing them can harm our well-being. And I just want you to, if you're not doing it already, think about a place that you're attached to. This could be a natural environment, or it could be a built environment. And so the same two studies as before with self-reflection also looked at place attachment and place identity. And they found that the abundance of tree cover and actual bird species richness were positively related to place attachment and place identity. So this means that the areas that had more trees and different species of birds, people said that they felt more attached to, and that they had greater identity to those locations. And that, again, people's perceived species richness of birds, butterflies, and plants was also related to place attachment and place identity. And that place identity was also found to be related to actual plant species richness. So this relates to how the different aspects of biodiversity can relate to different aspects of place attachment and place identity. And I'm going to hand over now to Loïc to give us a quick summary.
Yes, sorry for that last switch. I was going to give a quick recap, but it would be nice to have the 10 minutes discussion. So I'm gonna skip just 2 slides. Basically, I'm going to explain it with this one. You already saw it. It's about our project, Dr. Forest. The recap was going to explain what the effect of biodiverse forests would be on those health benefits, and basically, very, very easily put, very much simplified, we expect them to reduce the risks and to amplify the benefits, right? So we wanted to leave you with some take-home messages. We hope we at least convinced you a bit that biodiversity will be beneficial for your health and also for the health of nature. So that's where the health sciences and the ecology come together. But also that biodiversity will be more important in the future because of global change. We need healthy ecosystems to combat the adverse effects of global change. And biodiversity can also be beneficial for our health. Now, the bad news is that we're in the midst of a biodiversity crisis, which many authors argue that is as urgent as the climate crisis and equally bad, so that they need to be addressed in parallel together. This figure comes from this giant report on the state of our biodiversity, and it's depicting a quite grim picture of the state of our ecosystems. In red, you see the proportion of species threatened with extinction. But what's interesting with this report is that they directly equate this. They compare it with the nature's capacity to provide all of these ecosystem services that we talked about, the health-related ecosystem services, but ecosystem services in general. So they directly relate the reduction of biodiversity loss, for example, to the reduced ability now and in the future to regulate air, for example, or number 6, to regulate the fresh water quantity, which is, of course, also super essential for our health, or number 10, to regulate those harmful organisms that we talked about. This was my last take-home message. The biodiversity crisis is way less mediatized than the climate crisis, but it's important to take both into account at the same time. And now I'm giving, Melissa is going to take over for the last time.
Yeah, just so quickly, what can you do, or what does this mean for you? As individuals with interest in forest bathing, you may wish, if you're not already doing it now, to consider the biodiversity of the forest in part of your sessions, where, you know, the fact that maybe an intermittent, you know, a monoculture might not give as much benefits as maybe a medium level or a high level biodiverse forest, depending on some outcomes that you're interested in, be them attention restoration or stress reduction or transcendent experiences of awe. We don't really know what's the best mix yet for all outcomes. The other way that this might be of interest to you is you, as forest bathing practitioners, you're really responsible for the contact with biodiversity aspect of the model that we didn't really discuss. You know, the exposure, the frequency of duration of someone's exposure to a biodiverse environment, a biodiverse forest, as well as what their experience is when they're there. You know, you could guide people in their experience of being in a biodiverse forest to pay attention to different things, and that they're you guiding them to, you know, listen and hear, and the different sounds in a biodiverse forest may have outcomes in both the restorative benefits, the building capacities, but also the reducing harm pathways. And yeah, the last thing is you can also help biodiversity by growing the urban forest, by bringing it into nature around your home. And that's it for me. Thank you very much.